Thank you. Welcome, Desiree. So your session today, it's our session 10 of our live session. It's focused on the module on economics, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Alfredo. And good afternoon or good morning, everyone, or a good middle of the night if you're somewhere around the globe listening or tuning in to our session here today. I would like to thank, first of all, Alfredo and Glenn McKnight for inviting me here today, and I thank him for this intro. I'm not the first lady of Internet governance, as Professor Bill Drake introduces me at ICANN Studienkreise, which was a circle studying group studying ICANN back in 1999. And it was a second watchdog after Professor Michael Frumkin's site, ICANNWatch.org. But I'm just, like you, a member of the community, and I believe, like many of you, one of these Internet public servants who works to grow and protect the Internet for the benefit of Internet users. I see from Eka. And so that the Internet would stay globally connected and open to innovation, and also trustworthy for everyone. So this is also, that coincides with the mission of the Internet Society, whose mission I support, and on which board I also served. As Glenn mentioned, I also served as the special advisor of the UN first chair of the multi-stakeholder advisory group in the early days of 2006 until 2009. And today I serve on the program committee for the UK IGF, which is a national IGF. And also I co-chair the cooperation working group at RIPE, the RIPE community. I had an opportunity to give many lectures throughout the years to African School of Internet Governance, European Summer School, and the Middle Eastern and adjoining countries Internet Governance School. And it's always a pleasure to meet new students and interact and in discussion. So maybe just a small intro of why Glenn gave me the topic of economy in the Internet. A disclaimer: I'm not an economist and I'm not a lawyer, but a practitioner. So in 2008, I helped convene a roundtable session at the Oxford Internet Institute, which was when I co-wrote the paper, The New Economic Context of Internet Governance, that I'll mention later on. And because I was worried, how would the financial crisis impact the Internet governance processes? And as history shows, many regulatory practices stop abruptly once another major disaster takes over, as it were the case with the so-called antitrust laws in the US at the break of the First World War. All the regulatory practices stopped. So with that, I think I'll just go to the next slide and tell you the three things that we'll try to focus and talk about today. One of the things, as you know, is that firstly, I'll provide some background and basic concepts around the Internet and economy, which might be useful to some of you. And then I'll remind everyone why the Internet governance is important, and is important so much, especially today. I believe you are all aware of the recent Capitol Hill events, followed by the ban of the US president's account on Twitter and the temporary suspension of his account on Facebook. And it all shows that the political economy of free speech, of freedom of speech, is again a fresh example of where we may lack some norms and regulations, and why we continuously need to rethink those internet governance norms and regulations, and overall the impact that the internet has on the society. Then we'll look at some basic business models and digital economy business models. How is the internet run? What's its economy? And then we'll look at the business competition and antitrust, some examples of the internet governance as regulation of digital ecosystems. And prior to that, we'll look at some connections between the technology deployment and economics. And lastly, we'll look at some of the findings that we found back in 2008 about the new economic context of internet governance, and whether it really stands the time, and look at the internet governance multi-stakeholder model and some of the important economic negotiations that are taking place right now. If you are taking notes, I have prepared a last slide for you so that you have the links to most of the documents, relevant documents, and you'll be able to find them at the end of my presentation. So you can just relax and listen. Feel free to stop me if you have any question. So with that background that I mentioned, I think it's important always to start with the basics, and that is that the internet works because a lot of people cooperate, and they've decided to do things together. So it's a bottom-up process, and the gentleman on the photo is John Postel, is a computer scientist who has especially made huge contributions to internet development standards and contributed to the internet that we know today and that we use. And one of his even more interesting tenets of the internet architecture, and another quote, maybe even more famous than this one. Does anyone know what it is? Okay. So he said, be conservative what you put out, but be liberal in what you accept. He was talking about TCP/IP implementations and the robustness of the network. But it really is almost metaphorical and can apply to many other things. Okay, so the economics, some basic things. You know that economics is a social science, and that it's a branch of knowledge that really looks at how we as humans make some decisions, and in terms of how we consume services and goods. And there are basic four key concepts that the economists deal with when they look at the economics, and those are the scarcity and supply and demand, the costs and benefits, and incentives. So these four main concepts are really crucial for the economics as a science. Today we will be looking at the digital economy, and just a few words to orientate ourselves. Digital economies is a multi-trillion-dollar economy, and it's a digital economy that is growing at 8% a year, much faster than the rest of the economy. What I hope you will get from this lecture is that it would help you make up your mind or understand the importance of the economic issues as part of internet governance. And it's fair to say that the internet is not evenly distributed. It's a very much a well-known fact, and that fact that internet economy, digital internet economy, accounts for some 5% of the total economy in developing countries. As I said, I'll it's good to remind us always what internet governance is and why we're here today. And the internet governance has had many definitions since the working group on internet governance came up with the first back in June 2005. You can see it in this right-hand cloud. The internet governance, according to VSIG, is a development and applications of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures that shape the evolution and the use of the internet. But really, what it has turned out to be since 2006, since we had the first internet governance forum organized and the auspices of the UN, is really we're talking about the internet, the effects of the internet on society. So I like to simplify that. And in some cases, we are making recommendations about regulations, and we talk about better practices and better standards. And as I mentioned, a lack of those. When the internet breaks, who decides? Who pays? Who decides? Who decides? These are all the important questions that have multi-layers of complexity within them. And therefore, it's good to know a lot of about the technology, how it works, a lot about policy, a lot about economy, and how they interact together. So maybe one picture could tell you a little bit more. When we look at the internet protocols, there is obviously the financial protocol as well, which we're going to look at here today, and the political, which is always on the top. So that, as I said, it's a multi-layered aspect of internet governance that we are discussing. This chart here just shows you how everything is interconnected. It's been taken out from a book that I recommend you check. It's called The 10 Years Reflections of the VSIG Report and Whether It Still Stands. The group of people then tried to cluster all the internet governance issues, and maybe you know a lot about that. But why I took it here is because it says that, for example, cybercrime has an effect on the economic basket or a cluster. And through some study done by Jovan Kurbalia from Diplo Foundation and from many corpus texts of first 10 years of internet governance, and compared to the OECD principles, it found out that cybercrime affects e-commerce because of use of Bitcoin and cybercriminals. So 14% there's been a mentioning of the intersection of economy and cybercrime. But you can see there are all these other intersections as well on other aspects of internet governance, such as legal, human rights, security, infrastructure, socio-cultural, and development. In addition to economic issues. And one would say, I'm not following the chat room, so if there is something interesting, please feel free to, stop me or interrupt me as well. As I said earlier, one of the other things that we'll try to look at is how this is the technology deployment and the economics to see. And I found this example very useful that shows the connection between technology, policy, economy. The graph here is actually from someone else's presentation, but it summarizes the RFC 5218 that all you can look up, which actually talks about a deployment of internet standards. it is a fact that some internet standards are written and they do not get deployed. They're all not mandatory. They're open standards and voluntary adoption. But in this slide, you can see there is definitely a benefit in the early adoption in the slide B of internet standards, and that it outweighs the adoption costs. Still, it's a puzzle why we didn't adopt IPv6, because there are definitely some costs within the adoption. But in the long term, this RFC, the request for comments, I hope you're familiar with that, the IETF standards document, says there are extreme benefits in early adoption of internet standards. So having made that link, I think now we can also see there is some kind of almost a yin-yang relationship between the internet and economics itself, because the internet is today very much a basics of our economy, and almost all activity that we do in our daily lives in some fashion really depends on the internet, if not directly, then somehow indirectly, and it's not going away. And likewise, the economics really also drives very much what happens in the internet. We all witness the globalization forces, and that the consumers are always in search of globally cheapest producer and goods, and that all helps the trade. And the trend is definitely written that one and the other reinforces one another. So let's go then back to some of the basic types of business models on the internet. I'm sure you are aware that we're almost all producers of content somehow, if we use any of the digital platforms. Or you can see that on the internet, firms or companies or individuals are either selling or brokering something. And I won't go into, bookstores but anything, Etsy and lovely sites. And then we have these the ads-based business models, which are the basis of the biggest digital platforms that we know today. They're the basis of Google and Facebook's of the world, because ads are paying for the content that we see and then they carry. But there are other types of business models, and this is just a limited a list here. I think some main ones. There's like a user-provided content. You might be reading Reddit or Wikipedia and so on. So the consumers at the same time are providing content and providing and generating value. And we have to be careful with this overpowering, or rather cautious model of ads-based businesses. For at the moment, it's not solely run on ads. There is the infrastructure. There are companies and ISPs that provide connectivity and physical links and other sort of connections. But there are so many layers, and that, however, the top layer where the concentration of money and power, I would say, is in these digital platforms that are more and more replacing our public sphere. So if you haven't heard of Jeff Houston, you should, and you should invite him to give a lesson too. The advertising, he says, if the internet is heading down the same path as newspapers, where advertising became the tail that wagged the dog, and if advertising on the internet comes crashing down, what happens then? We're already witnessing the failure of newspaper model, and will we see a similar failure in the internet's future?
Desiree,
yes?
Following on that last comment, Zakaria has a question for you. He's asking, for the digital economy, what are the new digital computing technologies that you foresee?
So there, There's a bit of echo. If you maybe, Alfredo, mute yourself. Yeah. Thank you, Zachariah, for that question. There are many new digital computing technologies, so the innovation hasn't stopped, but certainly, we can see, for example, in terms of connectivity, there is LoRa networks that are being built in addition to Wi-Fi. I wouldn't say, whether they're so popular, but they definitely are being spread out in some parts of Europe, at least. And there are, when you say digital computing technologies, there's definitely a lot of data processing and computational companies that are doing just data processing, not data collecting. And there is a link to a good paper at the end of the slides that actually looks at the dynamics between digital ecosystems and whether we can decide about competition between the digital ecosystems and what's lacking to fully understand those. So-called artificial intelligence, right, is one of the new digital computing technologies that is going to take off. The VR, the virtual reality ones, there are many. So I wouldn't like to, and just solicit, just kind of name one or the other, but there are many. Certainly the AI is a important one, and important in terms of policies that would need to be created, and in order to have a really good implementation and development of AI as a new technology. Because does that answer your question? Or okay, it seems it does. So as I said, competition models in the internet are trying to get global audiences and global reach. And but one of the business models, which is an intro in what I'm trying to say, is really that we've seen so many times this model of winner takes it all. The build out of monopolies and the new trends of regulatory agencies and governments trying to regulate new powerful concentration, new powerful businesses where there's a lot of consolidation in the market and a lot of consolidation and concentration of power. Okay. Moving on, this antitrust is also known as competition laws, and those statutes reach far back in the 1890s in the US. And as the economy has to do a lot with consumer protection, so in order to then protect consumers from predatory business practices, the first Sherman Antitrust Act has been adopted by the Congress in the US, and they're trying to not just protect consumers but also small businesses from entering into the market. So it applies to a wide range also of questionable business activities, market allocation, bid rigging, trying to fix prices and price fixing, and growing into very powerful monopolies. And it's important to know that these laws were somehow been forgotten, and now I can see a renaissance of antitrust laws coming back across the globe, not just in the US but Europe. And if they didn't exist, the consumers and also small businesses would not benefit from these different services. and options or competition that we have in the marketplace. So we will be forced to pay higher prices, and we would also have access to probably a limited supply. So there's a question here: does net neutrality fall into this antitrust area? It's interesting that you actually say that, and it's a good question. The book that I recommend that you read is called The Internet Trap, written by Matthew Hindman, where he actually says that the way how the FTC, the Federal Communications Commission has been trying to sort the issue of competition, of net neutrality, which is when you have one or two providers competing for the business, or not enough of consumer choice to get access to the internet, and other bad practices they may come along. Matthew is saying that obviously these internet service providers were fighting for different digital audiences and customers, and that it's not sufficient that we just have the Title I changed into Title II to go back to Title I in terms of the telecommunications law and the Communications Act of 1934. But really, that to strengthen the net neutrality, we need to have an antitrust case as well. They take a lot of time, and I wonder if anybody knows what these people might have in common. Okay, you'll add this to complementary resources. Glenn McKnight says, yeah, they have money in inventors. Well, they were the industrialists, the biggest industrialists, the Rockefeller, Morgan, and Carnegie, JP Morgan and Carnegie, were all sued for antitrust practices in the US at the end of the 19th century. Rockefeller for his Standard Oil, and Carnegie had a steel industry, and JP Morgan. So yes, Bill says they all made big money in monopolies, and that was when the Congress actually had first enacted the so-called Sherman Act I mentioned earlier. And but you are probably much more familiar with the other big tech antitrust cases. And what I said earlier also, Ted Roosevelt was the one who was trying to get monopolies, to break monopolies up. But we have, after the Second World War, also seen many other antitrust cases, such as the one with IBM for, I think that took about 12 years, and then also that AT&T that in the end got broken up into baby bells. But I think if you are younger generation, you probably have heard of Microsoft antitrust case that also took a long time. And what happened there was that Microsoft was accused not just of trying to create monopoly to rival then the free Netscape browser. It had more money to actually coming from other products to offer a free browser, Netscape at the time. So it was first sued by the Department of Justice in 1998, and they actually found that Microsoft has violated parts of Sherman Act antitrust, and that they suggested that the company get brought into two entities. However, a long time, it's a very unpleasant period that I think is the reason why many corporate leaders at the time think that having your mails read and displayed in the courts is probably something that you can let or forego instead of trying to amass so much concentration and power. As I said, the Microsoft was not broken down. It appealed. It was overturned, but we now are really witnessing a lot of other antitrust cases. And only last year, in July 2019, the Federal Trade Commission have launched a so-called landmark antitrust lawsuit against Google and Facebook, and they are challenging their dominance in the marketplace. In particular, with regards to Facebook, if you're not familiar, Facebook has acquired a Instagram app, as I think people preferred Instagram to Facebook, and it was a competition. Therefore, it paid a lot of money to acquire Instagram, and then it further on acquired also WhatsApp. So you have some 2.7 billion users using now services between WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook. The December 11th, I think, was when there was a Facebook response, and they said they will try and fight it in court. But there was a really significant hearing last year against not just Facebook and Google, but also against Amazon and Apple. So the so-called GAFA. In the EU, where I work, and also the EU and antitrust is something that is trying to be reinforced through different regulations, because they take exactly a long time to resolve. As I said, IBM took some 12 years, and AT&T and Microsoft almost 3 years, and so on. So the Digital Services Act is something that has ex-ante regulatory powers to charge, not just financially penalize the company's digital platforms, especially ones that serve over 10% of population of the EU, with financial penalties, I think, towards breaching, having any activities that are found to be looking as antitrust. Therefore, they have come up with this new regulatory proposal called Digital Services Act that has been published on December 15, 2020. And now there is a period of consultation to see what the final Digital Services Act, how it will be implemented within the member states, and what will happen. But it certainly has a lot of power to deal with some of these market distortions and bad practices, and that some of the monopolies usually have. So I said that I would come back also to the, importance of having enough resources to do internet governance properly, somewhat, so that what we found out then in the 2008, following the crisis, the financial crisis, is that some of the internet governance activities we feared might stop. And therefore now with the pandemic, COVID pandemic, there's also a similar kind of worry. There'll be less funding going towards the activities of internet governance, that companies would not be paying and participating and giving their share in broadening the activities needed to have proper internet governance discussions about norms and regulations. So then back in 2008, I think it still stands that we as these forum participants of this roundtable I convened, we said that the funding and that the economic crisis and the funding for activities that are related to internet governance should be strengthened, and they should also be diversified. And that's all in order to keep governance activities alive. And this school is one form of that. And to engage broader participation. So, and all of that is really with the aim of ensuring that the internet keeps pace with these changing user requirements as the technology changes and any minute as well. So I think one thing that really stays here is that the lack of multi-stakeholder environment for input and dialogue is a transparency mechanism was the missing link that the financial companies could have benefited from, and they would have a better market self-regulation and evaluation processes. So we're trying to they should learn from the internet sector if we're doing a good job in there. Lastly, as I said, I will also mention some of the digital trade trends, and there is a newsletter that I subscribed, CCAOI, and you have heard from Amrita. I think some of you might be in this course 2 weeks ago. As well, I think she might have mentioned it. They do a really good summary of economic trends within institutions. So it's as of last activities, we can hear that one of the United Nations conferences on trade and development, so-called UNCTAD, and the International Trade Center and the World Trade Organization, which is not a UN agency. And they have launched the SDG Trade Monitor, the Sustainability Development Goals Trade Monitor, to track and to provide data on global trade contribution towards the UN Sustainable Goals. I hope you're all familiar with the UN Sustainable Goals towards 2030 and what we all as society and members have to do to reach those goals. The other thing that was also that is also interesting and mentioned was that these digital economy guidelines for successful digital economy were published in the Middle East, and there are also several organizations that have embraced these guidelines, including the Union of Arab Banks and Union of Arab Chambers and the International Network of Small and Medium Enterprises. And the Global Coalition for Efficient Logistics. So I believe this is all good news because there are important, the so-called traditional economic issues of internet governance, such as e-commerce, taxation, and currency, and the trade agreements where, in my view, we need to have a better multi-stakeholder environment in order to have a participation. It's almost like the very important and not the last barrier for internet users, academics, technical community, international organization to have a more active role than just leave it to the governments alone. And so the trends that I see in the digital trade and digital taxation and for the sustainability development is I wanted to mention a very important document that's called the E-Commerce Moratorium. And that's the document that's been adopted by the World Trade Organization back in 1998. And throughout the course of the years, they have been really they have been renewing this oratorium or extending the oratorium. It's a one page and it looks like that. It's a very important piece of document, but it recognizes that the global electronic commerce is growing and creating new opportunities for trade, and therefore the next slide is I'll go a little bit more further into WTO and then come back because there is a you can see the text and I can share it with you and then we can return back. So the General Council of the World Trade Organization has agreed to produce a report on progress, and they are working towards that program, but they also are declaring that members will continue their current practice of not imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions. And they also say when reporting on the third session, the General Council will review this declaration, the extension of which will be decided by consensus, taking into the account the progress of the work program. So it has not been extended, and now we can go back, but there is motivation to do so. The similar motivation is that I talked about earlier is something to do with digital taxation, and that some countries have introduced their national digital taxes. And as you know, we had browser wars, we had DNS wars, now we have digital taxation wars. And mainly with the US and the OECD organization has started negotiations already in 2015 on this new global tax regime where taxes are not collected where a corporation is headquartered, but where it does its business. You also know with the such nature of the internet that you have headquarters in one country and that the internet is cross-border, and that this is a very important stance, and it could be maybe argued either way. So there were two pillars in that. Pillar one would establish the new rules where the tax should be paid, and to ensure that digital intensive multinational enterprises such as those of Amazon, Facebook, and Alibaba and Tencent, that they pay taxes where they conduct sustained and significant business. This will be a big change in the environment. And the pillar two actually introduces a minimum tax to avoid the surge for tax havens. As you know, there are tax havens parts in the world, and the US under the previous president left the negotiations in June 2020, so we hope that they would be resumed, and that also what is important that the EU has made clear that there's no global agreement until mid-2021, and that they will introduce a European digital tax if such agreement is not made by mid-2021, which is this 6 months going forward. And you can see that the failure would risk tax wars turning into trade wars, and the time when the global economy is already suffering because of COVID enormously. And what they say is at stake is there's 200 billion in taxes annually, which is a big challenge to collect. So this WTO e-commerce moratorium we have already talked about. And as I said, I shared with you here some other important internet governance documents in history. And the link to this document we had in 2005, the WSIS Tunis agenda that does not specifically mention economy, but it mentions all the other things like capacity building, consumer protection, that are all interconnected with the economic issues and internet governance. So the report of VSIG in June 2005, they that was the first report that tried to cluster all internet governance baskets and issues. And then we also see that in Net Mundial multi-stakeholder statement, which I give you a link to, there's also some mentioning, and then the UN CST mapping of international public policy issues has extended that basket to 17 issues. And you would remember that in 2015, the Global Internet Governance Forum, IGF, got its extension for next 10 years until 2025. And therefore, Secretary General's UN Roadmap for Digital Cooperation was published last year, and with an aim to build an inclusive digital economy and society, and their measures. And you can also download that PDF and read that through. And lastly, not least, is the this EU call for members digital cooperation, or the Digital Services Act, published in December. And you have a link there. Also, which might be useful, is to leave you with some further papers and books to read that you might find useful, because there are so many economic issues. There is attention economy, there's gig market economy, there is political economy of freedom of speech, and there is the economy of cyber geography. That is explained really well in this book, The Internet Trap. And there is a very good book that I would also recommend by Brett Frischman, The Infrastructure, the Social Values of Shared Resources, and this OECD Principle for Internet Policy Making. It's also a very good source of information for you. The OECD paper that was just published last month that talks about understanding the dynamics between digital ecosystem at what produces value. Is it collected data, or is it the computational power that processes that data? And you can imagine what happens when you have both. You have the data and you have the computational power. And where the value is, you don't take any chances, whether it's in the data or the computational power. You have it all together as some of the main concentrated, one of the main digital platforms. I think they have both of these strengths in their digital ecosystem and their digital platforms. And also, I would advise you to read some of the classics, The Wealth of Networks by Yochai Benkler and Tim Wu on network neutrality. Zachariah, you had a question about that. And also some of the classics. There are many, many other books I would recommend. Shapiro, C. and Varian on Information Rules and Strategic Guide to the Network Economy. And also, if you're in particular interested about antitrust, there's a good podcast you should listen to, run by a colleague of mine, Azim Azar, and the last episode had something about antitrust as well. But I'm sure there's the internet and you can find a lot of information. And if you want to have another session or a talk, or you want to reach to me, please feel free to do so. And now let's go into some discussion, and because I finished my slides.
Great. Thank you, Desiree. I'm just going to turn my video on. Okay, I want to start off with questions with Alfredo. He writes in the chat, and then I'll go to Zachariah, and then I have a question as well. So we have 10 minutes or so. So first question from Alfredo: what global organization will enforce a world taxation regulation and oversee the collection of monies?
So as I mentioned earlier, it's not going to be a global organization that will oversee the collection of it. It's currently not the case. So this is the development at the moment. First, there needs to be an agreement that there is going to be collection of digital taxation. And then if that agreement is made, I think every country or a region can do it regionally. I do not see the need of overpowering, overseeing body to do it top down.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to the next question. How is the economic benefit measured? How do we get the metrics on this?
So from whose point of view? Is there who's asking that question?
It's Zachariah.
Zachariah, yeah. So you have the you need to take an example of one company and then see what they do and then try to measure benefits. But the benefits, the internet, as you know, provides so many surpluses. So even if you connect to the internet to, let's say, do only work, there are so many other surpluses that you can benefit from. So the benefits cannot be really, they're hard to measure. But we are aware that there are many surpluses that you get from connecting to the network. There are obviously also some downsides as well. Your network could be hacked, and there are costs to maintenance of the security of the network. So I don't know whether you're looking for the benefits of a particular organization or the figures I shared about digital economy shows you that an important 5% at least of developed countries is the digital economy, and that's all e-commerce, all trade, all transactions that go online and sales. So if you have a more specific question, as I said, I'm not an economist or a lawyer, I'm a practitioner.
Right. Well, thank you. It comes to mind articles I've read on internet shutdown, whether India or elsewhere. People have articulated, the cost to the economy when the internet shut down, and it's a massive amount that they speculate in the articles. I'm not sure how they quantify it, but it is deemed an incredible cost, not just from a human rights point of view, but economically. In the old days, in the 17th or 18th century, we had mercantilism, where you had the hinterland and the central areas being UK, other colonial countries, and they basically took raw materials out of their colonies back and sent back manufactured goods. So the entire model tended to favor or benefit the first world countries. Do we have another, because of the move to the digital economy, and it's so concentrated in mostly America and Europe, do we have a digital colonialism in terms of the same kind of unevenness and unfairness that happened hundreds of years ago? So we have a sort of a return to that sort of concentration of wealth. What's your view on that? You're muted, Desiree.
Yeah, I said I wanted to go briefly, just quickly back to Zachariah's question, like how do you measure, how would economists measure the benefits? I think what you can measure is some kind of economic impact, and they usually use 4 metrics. The economists, they look at the number of employed people, the employment, they look at household earnings, they look at economic output, that means how much a country has produced or exported, and they also look at this value added. And probably employment or jobs is the easiest way how to have some measure about the economy. The number of unemployed people in the country tells a lot about the state of the country and the economic impact. So I hope that answers your questions. But So these are, and then there are others like nominal price values, and you can go into many other more complex equations. But now to go to Glenn's question, I think you're right that internet shutdowns, as we have heard, are causing a lot of economic, they have a huge economic impact. And because businesses cannot trade, but not just economic impact, the human rights impact, and people lose lives. And in terms of what you're asking is the geography of where the wealth is concentrated, and whether we're seeing now the so-called developed countries, the winner takes it all model. And I think I talked a little bit about the business model and winner takes it all. And this is that concentration of power where in the past you would build a factory where you would ship the products. So that's already a concentration of services that somebody who's just a shipper would actually build a factory next door, and then they would become one big complex. And it's just concentration and vertical integration of these services. So there are definitely good examples of leapfrogging, where some countries in digital south and global south are really good are really doing really good job with. I would think of Kenya as well as being one example, and many others. So I don't think they need to be so much dependent on this infrastructure, but there is definitely no doubt that the way how the internet networks and the submarine cables and the infrastructure was built since the end of 19th century has been concentrated in these areas, North America and Europe, and therefore we have been able to amass and make a quicker progress with digital economy just because of the infrastructure that is there already. And you can have farms of servers, you can have farms of ISPs and connections, and you can have a lot of computational power as well, and fast links. So there is a discrepancy, but I think there's a lot of initiatives there were first to connect the rest of the world, and that globalization with the internet has completed, but there are still a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built. But you can leapfrog with some technology as well.
Great, thank you, Desiree. I'm just looking to see. I don't see another question in the chat, but I'll turn over to Alfredo. Did you have anything else to say, Alfredo?
No, thank you, Desiree. We're at the top of the hour already, so even if we had more questions, we don't want to keep the participants too late into the second hour. But I do want to thank you, Desiree, for your powerful and excellent presentation. All the resources, you can be sure that we will add them to our complementary resources section for this module, and I hope we can count on you for a future session with another one of our groups with exactly the same topic. I mean, it's excellent, and probably modify a little bit the approach, and we can dive into some aspects of internet governance in relation with how small developing islands or countries can implement some of these aspects of economic development and internet governance, because I'm not an economist, and I find it so fascinating as well. So there's a lot of questions that I could raise, but we don't have the time. So thank you again, and I want to remind everybody that you have until the end of the week to complete all the modules and the quizzes. And Glenn shared the invitation for those that do have the certificate of completion to our graduation session on February the 1st. Desiree, you are invited if you want to participate. It's 1 hour long, and we'll send you the link as well. Glenn, back to you.
Great.